So unfortunately, language is fluid, and so the meaning of words tends to change over time. Musical words and terms are no different. Very often, genres of music start with very broad meanings, but over time come to have quite specific meanings. And this is precisely what happened with the musical genre of the blues. Today, when someone says, "let's play a blues," they generally mean two very specific things. They want to A, use the 12-bar blues form, and B, use the blues scale to improvise. But originally, the term blues was much more general and vague. The blues began to emerge as a distinct genre of music in the late 19th and early 20th century. It evolved out of the field holler and work songs of African slaves in the south of the US. It took its name from the word blue, meaning to feel sad or depressed. Now, around this time, the guitar became widely available for the first time in the rural South of America. As a portable instrument, it was embraced by many African American musicians at the time. So the early style of blues, called country blues, or sometimes called Delta blues, was generally performed by a single male musician playing guitar and singing. Think musicians like Robert Johnson and Leadbelly. Now, slavery was officially abolished in the US in 1865, so needless to say, most of these black musicians were not formally educated in the intricacies of Western harmony and music theory or proper technique. This meant that their music was quite simple and repetitive and rough and primitive, but also emotional and straight from the heart and raw. These musicians tuned their guitars in unusual ways and played them by pressing knives or bottlenecks against the strings. They also sang emotively without worrying about, singing the major scale in equal temperament. So because of their lack of formal education, they often played and sang out of tune. That is, they played and sang blue notes. So blue notes originally actually referred to out-of-tune notes or microtones, or notes located between the 12 notes in Western music. But over time, the blues was picked up by professional musicians and formalized. As this happened, musicians had to fit these out-of-tune microtones into the pre-existing common practice Western musical system, and so this approximation meant that blue notes became the flat 3, flat 5, and flat 7, used over a major triad, which Western music theory said were wrong notes and therefore out of tune. But because of this, we lost the microtones, or the true blue notes. Though, of course, guitarists and singers can and do still hit these microtones by bending their notes, but unfortunately that's not possible on the piano. And of course, these out-of-tune blue notes could be used as an emotive device like any other musical device. Now, the blues was largely improvised. This meant that the form was loose and free. Early blues musicians didn't just stick to 12 bars. Some blues songs were longer and some were shorter. They were, after all, untrained musicians, so their music was a little bit unstructured. You only need to look and listen to early blues songs by people like John Lee Hooker or Blind Willie Johnson to hear their non-12 bar structures. In fact, blues songs would often just sit on one single chord for the whole song. It was only later in the 1910s and 1920s when blues became more popular and was taken up by professional musicians like Ma Rainey that blues really began to become more codified and standardized. W.C. Handy, known as the father of the blues, was one of the first people to start writing down the blues songs that he heard in sheet music. And he's credited with giving the blues its contemporary 12-bar structure or stanzas, with the standard chord progression that we all know. He was really instrumental in taking that rural and regional blues style and popularizing it across America. And lyrically, the blues consisted of a 3-line stanza, with the first line being repeated in the second line to allow extra time for the musician to think of a third line that rhymed. It was also generally sung in the first person and so very personal. Now this was different to earlier folk songs that were generally in 2 or 4-line stanzas and sung in the third person. So the blues evolved from having a varied, irregular and improvised form to a standard 12-bar form, generally, though obviously not necessarily. There are also 8-bar blues and 16-bar blues and things like that, but primarily the 12-bar blues is the standard progression. The chord progression in early blues was also varied and pretty complex and irregular, whereas in contemporary modern blues, it's primarily the 1, 4 and 5 chord, plus a few other chords as little passing chords. Similarly, in early blues, the scales they used were varied and contained microtones. Whereas in contemporary blues, we generally stick to the blues scale, although also add some diatonic notes at the soloist's discretion. And in early country blues, the blue notes were microtones, whereas in contemporary blues, blue notes are the flat 3, flat 5 and flat 7. So that's a short history of the blues, and I tell you it because I want to illustrate that the blues did not come from the Western musical tradition, and therefore does not conform to our Western rules of harmony. Now, there are a lot of differences between blues and, say, classical music, the two obvious ones being that traditional Western music is composed, whereas the blues is improvised, and traditional Western music is in straight rhythm, whereas the blues is in swing rhythm. Right, that's a pretty self-evident and boring analysis. But more interestingly, the blues breaks a number of Western rules of harmony. Now, the key differences between Western harmony and blues harmony are: in the West, we traditionally use functional harmony, where you use dominant chords to resolve to the tonic chord a fifth lower, like a G7 going to a C major 7. Whereas the blues uses non-functional harmony. The dominant chord does not resolve to the tonic chord. In fact, we use a tonic dominant chord that doesn't resolve anywhere. It's a dominant chord that sounds resolved, which is quite unusual and really largely unheard of in the traditional Western rules of harmony. Now, a possible westernized explanation of this blues harmony is that we're using borrowed chords. We're borrowing the 1 dominant from the Mixolydian mode and the 4 dominant from the Dorian mode. Traditional Western music also used the 5-1 perfect cadence a lot. It was their most important cadence that established tonality. Whereas in the blues, the 4-1 plagal cadence is the most important. Now, this is actually not that unusual and may have come from a church hymn influence where plagal cadences are often used, and in fact they're called the Amen cadence. And again, in traditional Western harmony, we never combine the major third and minor third. It's only ever one or the other. Whereas in the blues, we do combine the minor third and the major third, because we've got the dominant chord with its major third, but the blues scale with its minor third, which goes against all of Western harmonic theory. What key or tonality are you in if you're using both the major and the minor third? Now again, a possible Western explanation for this is that the minor third is actually a sharp 9 of a dominant chord, and the major third is the real third. Again, in Western harmony, we're not allowed to use a natural 11 tension over a dominant chord. This is not an available tension. Whereas in the blues, we often do use the natural 11 over a dominant chord, and the natural 11 or the 4 is heard a lot in blues melodies. And once again, a possible explanation for this is that we're just playing outside, which is creating tension, which then wants to resolve. In traditional Western music, we restrict ourselves to 12 notes of fixed frequencies, ignoring the changes of tuning systems over the centuries. Whereas in blues, or at least in early blues, they use microtones, and as I said earlier, guitarists and singers still bend notes to get microtones. And a possible explanation for this is again that we're just playing outside by playing those out of tune microtones, which creates tension that then wants to resolve. And finally, traditional Western music uses a leading tone, that is the 7th degree of the scale, to build tension and then resolve to the tonic chord. For example, what note comes next? Bum! Right? We all heard that. We all felt like that's where the melody was leading, like that's the natural resolution. Whereas in the blues, there is no leading tone in the blues scale. We have a flat 7 instead, which doesn't quite have the same pull to the tonic. Instead, in a blues, the flat 3 is generally used to build tension that then resolves to the tonic. Again, what note comes next? Right, the C. The flat 3 has the same kind of pull to the tonic in a blues as the leading note has in traditional Western music. Now again, a possible westernized explanation for this is that we're playing outside, which is creating tension that then wants to resolve to the tonic, but personally, I don't think that's a very good explanation. It doesn't really explain why the flat 3 in particular pulls to that tonic, why it serves the same purpose as the leading tone in a classical piece. Now, we can think about this blues harmony in 3 different ways. First, that blues harmony is wrong and that Western harmony is right. And thus, blue notes and all the other things that I listed just now are intentional dissonances that break the rules of harmony, like playing outside, but they just never resolve. Second, blues harmony is a mixture of major and minor tonality. It's really in a major or a minor key, like any other Western song, but just uses a lot of modal interchange. So, for example, the blues is really in, say, a major key, but we just borrow the minor 1 chord to get that flat 3 and natural 11 as an available tension. And thirdly, the blues is its own unique form of tonality, with its own rules of dissonance and consonance. And while the blues may have sounded dissonant to Mozart, who would have never heard the blues in his life, because we've been exposed to the blues and blues-influenced music for over a century now, we've grown used to how it sounds and have accepted its unique rules of harmony as a parallel system to the Western rules of harmony. Now, personally, because of the history of the blues and how it arose from uneducated non-European musicians, I think that the last option offers the best explanation. The blues doesn't sound wrong or dissonant or unpleasant. But it also doesn't sound like it's in a major key with lots of borrowed minor chords or in a minor key with lots of borrowed major chords. In fact, because of the nature of microtones, it's possible that an out-of-tune blue third could have been exactly halfway between a major third and a minor third, and thus be neither in major or minor. Right, so to me, the first two theories or explanations for blues harmony don't make sense. The blues does actually sound interesting and pleasant and good. It doesn't sound horribly dissonant like it's breaking all the rules of harmony. It sounds like it has its own internal logic, its own internal rules. The blues is its own separate tonality developed outside of the West, to which we have become familiarized and accustomed. In fact, tonality and functional harmony was only really created in the 1600s. Before this time, all music was modal. You just have to listen to Gregorian chants for an example of music before Bach. So new harmonic systems are created, and we do get used to new harmonic systems and accept them, just like when music went from modal to tonal harmony. And an equivalent thing happened with the blues in the early 1900s. And of course, you're welcome to disagree with me, but in my mind, the blues has its own set of harmonic rules and its own internal logic and is its own tonality.